Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at this conference. And I really look forward to talking with all of you throughout the conference, through your questions after my talk, hopefully there will be time, and through the conference and maybe beyond that. So I'd like to begin by suggesting that certification emerged out of the need for a global culture of forests and a global culture of wood, and most particularly out of the need for a culture that links forests and wood. And I'll explain what I mean in a minute. It emerged trying to address global scale challenges in what you could call as an impersonal marketplace. We know what a lot of these challenges are, problems with illegal logging, forest degradation, deforestation, rural poverty, and their linkage possibly to, well, their linkage with global warming. And until recently, the marketplace was pretty much blind to the connection between the management of our resources and the products that we use. Okay, oops, okay. Now, not only are the challenges global, but so are the stakeholders. That makes it really fun. There is plenty of debate and a diversity of opinions to go around. This is an example of some of the dynamics in British Columbia, Canada, where we've done some of our research. There's a lot of debate about forestry and its impacts on the natural environment in British Columbia. So this is an example of some Hollywood superstars from the US criticizing BC forest practices, including actors like Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman and Robert Redford. So this has a global impact. It means that one country's business seems to be another country's business, whether we like it or not. So there's various ways that people have tried to deal with developing more of a global level of agreement over forestry. There's been efforts on the part of governments to work together to come up with some kind of consensus on forestry. Key event was the Earth Summit in 1992. And there were several major environmental conventions that came out of this, including one on biodiversity, one on desertification, and one on climate change. But no forest convention. There were a number of countries that would have liked one forest convention, and others felt that was not the right tool to address the issue. Meanwhile, there are some non-governmental actors, including NGOs and some producers, et cetera, that thought, well, let's try a different strategy. If it's very difficult to come to an intergovernmental agreement, what if we try to harness the marketplace to make change? So one of the first initiatives on this was the Forest Stewardship Council that got started 1 year after Rio in 1993. What this is about is what we're talking about, linking forest management to wood. So the idea is fairly simple. You certify forest practices that are good, that meet a set of environmental and social criteria of appropriate forestry. And you reward foresters and forest companies that meet those standards by labeling the products that come from the forest with an eco label, a green label. And then the idea is that consumers can support good forestry by buying labeled products. So how was this idea of good forestry defined? Well, to the FSC, they developed 10 principles through an international consensus process that addressed a whole range of challenges within forestry. They address illegality, that forests follow the laws. They addressed issues of land tenure, of indigenous rights, community benefit, economic viability, environmental impacts, the need to plan and monitor to make sure you're achieving what you set out to do. And as mentioned by our speaker before, the issue of high conservation value forests. How do you make sure to protect very special forests within your country and globally? And then the issue of plantation, should they be managed differently? Well, again, though, this all sounds good. They're kind of what we call in the US sort of motherhood and apple pie principles, in that you can't really argue that these are good things. The question is, though, how do you implement them? And to think about what the challenges are here, if we're talking about a global culture, who is involved? There's quite a range of actors. We have, say, a logger from Canada, a fuelwood gatherer from Nepal, a high-tech paper company, indigenous people, And the idea is that all of them will come to agree what good forestry is so that you can sell products that demonstrate a good forestry. Well, we haven't quite come to a consensus yet. And one of the ways we can understand this is that there are a multiplication of forest certification systems. There's not just one system out there. There are quite a few. And so, in fact, we have now, well, many national schemes that have emerged. For example, in the US, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative was started, partly in response to the FSC, that the FSC did not meet the needs of some of the producers, and so they thought, we'll start our own system. And this has happened in Canada, CSA, there's the Malaysian Timber Certification Council, in Indonesia, LEI. So with this proliferation of systems, there's a bit of confusion in the marketplace. And what has happened over time is that these two different systems, you could say, have settled into two different camps. There's the FSC system, and then there's what is called the PEFC, Program for the Endorsement of Certification Systems. The PEFC basically was a means to provide mutual recognition among many of these schemes according to a common set of standards. So now we have about 22 schemes endorsed under the PEFC, and then we have the FSC, and then in Indonesia, LEI has formed a mutual recognition relationship with FSC. So while we're trying to work towards a global consensus, there's a lot of diversity out there, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. But then a big question that emerges is, what is the difference between these systems? I mean, why do we have all these different systems? Aren't they doing the same thing? And that's a really good question, and I don't think any one person has the answer to that necessarily. But you can look at, identify some differences. There are differences in the way that the systems are governed, in terms of stakeholder involvement, how their decisions are made, and how their organization is structured. There are differences in the standards along a range of issues like protected areas, exotic species, genetically modified organisms, chemical use, riparian protection, etc. And our program has done a fair amount of research looking at some of the differences between written standards. But the real question is, what is the difference in impact? It doesn't really matter what is in writing. We really care about what happens in the forest. And this is where I say there needs to be a lot more research, because I don't think we can really answer that question, at which system is meeting what impacts. And maybe the way to get past a lot of the debate over this system, over that system, is to actually focus on what we're trying to achieve and move dialogue that way. But anyway, as an example of, just to show some of the differences between standards and some of the work that we have done in that area, this is just a very, small snapshot of a few standards that are active right now in North America, in the US, in Canada. There are 5 on the left there. It lists 5 different certification systems. And on the right, it lists what their policies are about riparian zone management, which is basically just protection of forests along streams and rivers. As you can see, there's one standard that's in British Columbia under the FSC that has up to 50-meter no-harvest zones along the streams. There are other FSC standards that have no requirements in that regard. No standardized requirements, I should not say that. There are no standardized requirements. That's not the approach they've taken. Then some of the other systems, SFI and CSA, also don't have requirements. So you can see that, yes, there are differences in the standards. But again, we don't really know what that means. We do know, though, that there's still a lot of debate among the systems. So this leads to the market campaigns. There are some strong supporters of either system. This is an example, some more dramatic examples of what has happened in the debate over forest certification systems. There's one on the left of a Greenpeace activist stopping a shipment of timber from British Columbia from entering Norway. This other one is of demonstrators in front of a big Canadian forest company's office protesting the company's practices. So this is very much of a global international concern past this. But also, this plays into how certification has evolved over time. There's a very specific market response to this particular strategy, and that is in North America and Europe, some very big brand names did not want to be picketed and decided to support certification, including Home Depot, Time Magazine, Mitsubishi, a number of very big names. and not necessarily to one certification system or another, but they said we will move towards procuring our wood from, that is certified from sustainable forests. But it also led to a major focus on North America and Europe, and especially North America and Europe, because that's where most of the supply, the majority of the supply was coming from, especially in the case of the US. So what's happening here is that up until recently, I think this is March 2007, oh, that was, we can see there's a very uneven distribution of certification around the world. In North America, about 32%, Europe, 53%. The reason that is so big is particularly because of Russian forests. There have been a lot of certification in Russia recently. In Asia, it accounts for only about 2% of the certified forests so far. In Africa, 3%. So, and so on. So it's very unevenly distributed. Another way of looking at this, well, is what percentage of the forest land is certified, and then you see that in North America actually has the highest percentage certified. And this looks at all of the different systems. And then Asia and Africa have less at this point. But we can see that overall, in all regions of the world, in all different kinds of forests, there has been a fairly rapid growth in certification. And even from December 2006, when this slide ends, until now, it's increased even more quickly. So something is happening there. And I would say also what's starting to happen is a lot of learning. You could call it global learning. People have realized that in order for this system to work and be equitable and to work everywhere, we need to learn more about different countries and regions and what their conditions are, what makes certification work in one area and not in another. There's been work on studying the markets. If this is a market instrument, then we need to understand the market or it's not going to work very well. Also a move towards collaboration between stakeholders and partnerships. So one thing that developed country stakeholders have been learning is that in some countries, in developing countries, there are very different market conditions. There may or may not be a demand for certified wood everywhere, the same as there might be, say, for example, in Europe in particular. There's also very rapidly expanding economies and need for a large amount of wood, and that's growing over time. And different production patterns. In many countries, fuel wood and subsistence uses may be responsible for more wood consumption than any other use. And that doesn't, how does certification affect that? It's a global market instrument. Is it designed to address those kinds of issues? There's land tenure disputes and illegal logging. So people realize, well, maybe we better think more about our strategies. So this is just because I'm in China. I should point out that, as we all know, that the demand for wood products in China has grown very rapidly and is projected to continue to grow. But no one country, China or anyone else, is acting in isolation. They're very complex supply chains. A lot of, some of the growth is driven by demand from other countries. The US is the largest buyer of Chinese wood products, sorry. And the EU and Japan are also major buyers. So we have to look at this as a global phenomenon in order to understand what we might do to address some of the issues. So here are some countries that are very important sources of wood for these markets, for China, for the US, buying from China, for Europe, for many countries, including Russia, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Myanmar. These are just some important producers. And there are some problems with forestry there. It's hard to come up with a really perfect estimate of the problems of illegal logging, but this was produced by the International Tropical Timber Organization, just as a very rough estimate. And the estimates vary quite a bit. Here in Russia, they say anywhere between 20 and 50% of production as illegal, however variously defined. In Indonesia, sometimes there have been estimates as high as 90% or 51%. The point is that we don't know, it all depends on how you define illegal, but we do know that there's an issue. Now certification is starting to try to address this. There has been growth certification in this greater region, particularly in Russia. Actually, this was March 2007. By now there's over 17 million hectares certified, just under specifically the FSC, because that's been most active there so far. A lot less in Indonesia, and then some countries, if you want to buy certified wood, you can't. So what do? If you want to improve your wood supply, you can't just rely on certification. So this has led to development of all kinds of other strategies, which I'd be very interested in talking with people about. For example, linking development aid and investments to the verification of legal sources of wood, international procurement policies. Now, the idea of legal verification is a sort of a first stepping stone for trying to address the problem of how can you find sustainably produced wood, and it just focuses on whether it's legal. And some governments and companies have collaborated with different countries to try to see if you can develop a sort of stepwise approach to bringing people up to the producers up to the level of certification through a stepwise process. First you start with legality verification, then you add on a few extra requirements, and then ultimately the idea is that they will be able to achieve certification over time, and that this is seen as a more reasonable approach. And also you've had governments step in, for example, in New Brunswick in Canada, requiring that all licensees on Crown land, on government land, have to be certified to some system. And in Bolivia also, a lot of government involvement in certification. More specifically, just some names that we might recognize, IKEA is got a very well planned out process for its wood procurement that follows a kind of stepwise model. They want to make sure first that their suppliers can prove that that's legal wood, that they had the right to harvest, and then move on from there, ultimately committing over a certain number of years to becoming certified. Then you have things like the Equator Principles, which involve some major banks around the world. Started with a major founding member is the Citibank, for example, and they developed their own set of principles, and they're working on a policy on certification as a way of deciding where they want to invest their money, if people are meeting certain basic requirements of good forestry or sustainable forestry. And then there's government procurement policies. United Kingdom, Denmark, Netherlands have developed detailed policies as to both what kind of forest certification system they recognize, and also what do they recognize as legal verification of wood products. So there's getting to be more and more examples of different ways that people have tried to address this issue, and that means a lot of ideas floating around and a lot of opportunity for us all to learn from each other. And then, of course, donor agencies also adopting their own policies. So, for example, in China, there's definitely evidence of growing interest in certifications, people mentioned. So far, March 2007, there was about 442,000 hectares certified, but perhaps even more of an indicator is there are 259 FSC chain of custody certificates, which is basically a company will apply for an FSC for a chain of custody certificate if they want to sell certified products. They need to be certified as a retailer of certified products. So this says that there are 259 companies out there that want to sell certified products. Now, just as there is diversity of how certification is developed in each country and in each region, there's also diversity across products. I mean, some products may be more amenable to a certification market than others. We found, for example, in North America that paper the demand for certified paper has grown very rapidly, and that's responsible for an enormous series of certification in Canada, for example. A lot of major paper and pulp companies getting certified, and there's a whole lot of reasons we can go into some other time about why it might be that some products are just more amenable to certification. Also visible products, because people are more likely to be concerned about where a product comes from if they see it. So something like furniture. China produces a lot of furniture and flooring, etc. People are going to want to know where that comes from. Or as structural lumber or plywood, they may not really think about it so much. And then I really want to mention a major, just emerging, growing market in the U.S. and elsewhere in green building. That's something else, some research project that we're involved in right now. Green building is basically certifying buildings that are environmentally friendly. And part of that is what do you use as construction material. And actually, the first way that wood has been recognized as a good thing in green building is that there have been credits awarded due to forest certification. So wood that was certified have gotten credits towards green building certification. In other ways, though, wood is not recognized yet as any more preferable to steel or other building materials, and this is very controversial and something that they're trying to work on. But this could have a major impact. For example, in the US, about 70% of the solid wood market is, goes into residential buildings, and now that green certification is moving into residential building, this is going to possibly have quite an impact on demand for certified wood. So, just in general conclusion, I'd say that there sort of is a global culture of forest and wood certification that's developing. And some of the key features of it are that wood can be good. It can be good. People can see it as a positive thing, especially if it meets a certain set of criteria that people can agree on as responsible production. It's also a culture of very much of multi-stakeholder interaction. Whether we like it or not, there's a lot of debate, and there still will be, but a lot of learning that goes on as a result of that. And I think you could say there's a development of international forestry norms happening here. And just through developing certification standards, people are coming to some kind of agreement in different arenas about what good forestry is. And you also see among the forest certification systems over time, they become increasingly similar in a number of ways. And overall, I think the culture is about what some people call a triple bottom line. The idea that, that basically we want to promote economic benefit and growth, balanced with environmental protection and equity in the use of forest resources. Thank you.
Compared to North America, China has only a fraction of percentage of forests which have been certified. And on the other hand, we know that China has a huge forest land base, and also China become increasingly important on national forest product trade. And in your opinion, what are the challenge and opportunity, for the forest certification in China, and what China need to do, and what the rest of the world could do, to promote forest certification in China? Thanks.
Yes, I think China is already doing a lot, and I know they're developing the National Forestry Initiative. And I think a key component, what we've learned from all the regions, is multi-stakeholder dialogue, getting everyone to the table to agree. Because as was very evident, for example, in British Columbia, I was there when they were developing the FSC standard, extremely contentious. And if any one group tried to just, move ahead without agreement from everyone, it tended to backfire. So that's one of the key things is dialogue. And I also think that because this is becoming such a prevalent global scale movement, there's a lot of opportunity for countries to learn from each other. I also I know our program is very interested, like I had mentioned earlier, in doing research on certification impacts, because one of the ways to try to move past the contention over one certification system over another is just to focus on what do we want to achieve and how can we measure whether we've achieved that. So if we could have research projects in China and the US and in other countries looking at impacts, comparing systems, but really that's ultimately not the goal. The goal is to see what works and what doesn't. And we can all learn from that. And every time a country starts a new program, it can be and benefit from all the learning in the past.